And getting 1% better each day is a way to encourage that. The story that I like to tell, and this is something that I kind of kick Atomic Habits off with, it's the story of the British cycling team. And, for many years, British cycling was very mediocre. They had never won a Tour de France, which is the premier race in cycling. They had won a single gold medal over like a 100-year span. And they brought this new performance coach in named Dave Brailsford. And he had this concept that he called the aggregation of marginal gains. The aggregation of marginal gains. And the way that he described it was the 1% improvement in nearly everything that we do related to cycling. So they started looking at a bunch of things you would expect a cycling team to focus on. Like they put slightly lighter tires on the bike, or they designed like an ergonomic seat for the riders. They had the riders wear a little feedback sensor, a little chip to see how each individual responded to training. Then they would adjust the practice schedule. But then they started doing like these little 1% changes, these small improvements that nobody else was really thinking about. Like they hired a surgeon to come in and teach the riders how to wash their hands to reduce the risk of catching a cold or getting the flu. They have this big trailer, like a semi-trailer that carries a lot of bikes in it to major events, and they painted the inside of that truck trailer white so that it could spot little bits of dirt and dust that might get in the gears and degrade the performance of the bikes. They have two different types of fabrics. They've got like indoor racing suits and outdoor racing suits. And they tested those fabrics in a wind tunnel, and they found out that the indoor fabric was lighter and more aerodynamic, so they asked all of their riders to wear that fabric. They even had other different riders test, like a bunch of, like maybe a dozen different types of pillows, and then they see which one led to the best night's sleep for each person. And then once they figured that out, they brought that on the road with them to hotels for the Tour de France and so on. Wow. And Brailsford said something like, if we can actually do this, if we actually make all these 1% improvements related to cycling, then I think we can win a Tour de France within 5 years. He ended up doing well. They won the Tour de France in 3 years, and then they repeated again the fourth year with a different rider. And then after a 1 year break, they won 3 more in a row. So after having never won for like 110 years, they won 5 in the next 6. And I like to use that story as an introduction to this idea of getting a little bit better, making these 1% improvements for a couple of reasons. The first is it shows you that excellence, a lot of the time, maybe you can even say most of the time, is not actually about radical change. It's about a commitment to accruing small improvements day in and day out. Secondly, and I think this is also crucial, it encourages you to focus on trajectory rather than position. Right? There's a lot of discussion about position in life. How much money is in the bank account? What is the number on the scale? What is the current stock price? What are the quarterly earnings? There's all this measurement around our current position. But what getting 1% better each day encourages is to focus on your trajectory instead. And by getting better, is the arrow pointed up and to the right, or have we flatlined? Maybe you're 1% better or 1% worse. Because if you're on a good trajectory, all you need is time. Right? If you have good habits, time becomes your ally. You just need to let time work for you. But if you have bad habits, time becomes your enemy. And every day that clicks by, you kind of dig the hole a little bit deeper. And so it's very much at the core, it's about encouraging you to focus on trajectory rather than position.
How did you get the 37.78 times better? Like, where'd that ratio number come from?
Yeah, it's just math, right? So if you get 1% better each day for a year, so 1.01 to 365th power, then you get 37 times better by the end of the year. If you get 1% worse, 0.99 to 365th power, then you drive yourself almost all the way down to zero. Now, look, real life is not exactly like a mathematical equation, right? Your habits are not exactly like this formula, but I do think that it highlights an important concept, which is the difference between making a choice that's 1% better or 1% worse on any given day is relatively insignificant, but it's very easy to dismiss. And this is, I think, one of the things that makes it underappreciated or underestimated. You're like, what is the difference between eating a burger and fries for lunch today or eating a salad? Or, going to the gym for 30 minutes or not? Well, on any given day, not a whole lot. Your body looks the same in the mirror at the end of the night. Scale hasn't really changed. It's only 2 or 5 or 10 years later that you turn around and you're like, oh, those daily choices really do add up. And I think you see this pattern again and again throughout life. Like take knowledge, for example. The person who always reads for an extra 10 minutes each day. Well, look, reading for 10 minutes a day does not make you a genius, right? It's very easy to dismiss. But the person who always does that over 5 or 10 or 20 years, really meaningful difference in wisdom and insight. Productivity is the same way. Like the person who gets 1 extra task done each day. doing one extra thing does not make you an all-star. Again, over a 10 or 20 or 30-year career, that can be a really meaningful difference in output. So this pattern shows up again and again. Where it starts out small and relatively easy to dismiss, compounds or turns into something much more significant over time.
The biggest word, bro. I don't think most people take into account, you and I are both college baseball players, good ones, but neither one of us were, surefire first-round draft pick major league players. And I think most people don't take into account the compound effect. I don't think they understand it in money. I don't think they understand it in their bodies, both positive and negative. I don't think they understand their identity or in habits. The compound effect in life of allowing small things to stack up over time has a multiplier effect. And one of the things that I feel like in your work, and by the way, your work is, we're a few minutes in here and I'm like, this is so good. And the reason is one, I believe most people believe they can get 1% better every day. I don't think most people believe that they can completely transform everything in one big leap. I think there's a multiplier. Do you agree that between doing the right things 1% or just better habitually every single day, not only are you actually making deposits of doing things correctly or better, but there's a part of your identity that starts to change over time about how you view yourself, that I am that guy who doesn't eat the hamburger and fries when he can choose to eat the other one. And you stack those choices and behaviors up over time, and you start sort of believing maybe you deserve something that you didn't deserve prior. Doesn't there a factor of that, don't you think, as well?
This is a huge part of kind of my philosophy and book, this idea of what I call identity-based habits. But essentially, the concept is, and I think this is the real reason that habits matter. The surface level reason that habits matter is they help you be more productive, they help you make more money, they help you lose weight and get fit. And look, habits can do all those things, and that's great. But I think the deeper reason that they matter is that every action you take is like a vote for the type of person you wish to become. And so when you perform these small habits, when you take these little actions, you're casting votes for a certain aspect of your story or a certain element of your identity. In a sense, every time you perform a habit, that's how you embody that aspect of your identity. So, when you make your bed in the morning, you embody the identity of someone who's clean and organized. Or if you write one sentence, you embody the identity of someone who is a writer. And this is why it can be valuable, even to do one push-up. It's like, no, that does not transform your body, but it does cast a vote for, I'm the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. And eventually, as you build up evidence of that story, as you start to cast more votes for that identity, you have actual proof to believe this, right? I think this is a little bit different than, you'll often hear something like, fake it till you make it. And I don't necessarily have anything wrong with fake it till you make it. It's asking you to believe something positive about yourself, but it's asking you to believe something positive without having evidence for it. And we have a word for beliefs that don't have evidence. We call that delusion. Right? At some point, your brain doesn't like this mismatch between what you say you are and what you're actually doing. And so my argument is to let the behavior lead the way. To start by meditating for 1 minute or doing one push-up or writing one sentence and letting that be undeniable proof that in that moment, you were a meditator or an athlete or a writer or whatever it is. And ultimately, I think this is the real value that habits provide, which is they reinforce your desired identity.
Well, it's just so good, brother. So good. I don't know why I'm just meeting you now, because our overall belief system about change is so very, very similar. And, we're talking about how to actually begin to establish habits. But before we do that, I want to talk about the concept of establishing one, because you said something about the one push-up. Reading or listening to something you were talking about the guy who would go to the gym for just 5 minutes and work out and leave. And you said something about this casting the vote for who you want to be or who you're going to be. That was powerful, right? But you're saying before a habit can be, and I don't want to quote you incorrectly, but I want you to elaborate on it, because this is profound to me. I mean, it's obvious, but if you don't step back and get away from it and look at it, you just really don't realize the truth of it. Before a habit can be improved, it has to actually be established. And I think what happens is, you tell me what you think. Beginning of the year, I'm going to lose 50 pounds. I'm going to do this. I'm going to eat 5 minutes. I'm going to starve myself to 500 calories. So it's not a 1% improvement. I want to get up earlier. I'm going to get up 2 hours earlier starting tomorrow instead of get up 15 minutes earlier. Right? Get up a minute earlier. So talk about that from just the concept for everyone to they can take control of their life right now by just the establishment of a habit. Right or right?
Yeah, definitely right. So one of the concepts I talk about in the book is this, one of the strategies is this idea of what I call the 2-minute rule, where I encourage people to build a habit that takes 2 minutes or less to do. So you take whatever you're trying to do, but read 30 books a year, becomes read one page, or do yoga 4 days a week, becomes take out my yoga mat. And sometimes when I mention that idea, people resist it a little bit because they're like, okay, buddy, I know the real goal isn't just to take my yoga mat out. I know I'm actually trying to do the workout. So if this is some kind of mental trick, then like, why would I fall for it, basically? Well, I tell the story of this guy, Mitch, that you mentioned. This guy who I talk about in Atomic Habits. He went to the gym. He's lost over 100 pounds, kept it off for more than a decade. And when he first started going to the gym, he wouldn't stay for longer than 5 minutes. He had this little rule. He had to leave after 5 minutes. So he'd get in the car, drive to the gym, get out, do half an exercise, get back in the car, drive home. And it sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds silly. Like, obviously, he's not going to get the guy the results that he wants. But if you take a step back, you realize that he was mastering the art of showing up. Right? He was becoming the type of person that went to the gym 4 days a week, even if it was only for 5 minutes. And this gets us to that deeper truth about habits that you just mentioned, this idea that a habit must be established before it can be improved. It has to become the standard in your life before you can optimize it and scale it up into something more. And, I don't know why we do this. Like, we get very all or nothing about our habits. We're so focused on finding the perfect business idea, the best workout program, or the ideal diet plan that we spend all our time theorizing and researching and looking for a better way. And instead, if we could just master the art of showing up, even if in the beginning it was less than what you had hoped to do, you're establishing a foothold. You're building some small progress that you can advance off of. And it reminds me of Ed Lattimore has that great quote where he says, the heaviest weight at the gym is the front door. And man, there are a lot of things in life that are like that. Like the hardest part is getting started. The hardest part is establishing the routine, even if it's a lower level baseline than what you ultimately hope to achieve. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, if you can't become the type of person who masters the art of showing up, even if it's just for 5 minutes, then it doesn't matter how good the plan is. It doesn't matter how great your theory is. And so I think the 2-minute rule pushes back on that perfectionist tendency a little bit and just encourages you to master the art of showing up.
So good. I'm right. Just finished a book called One More. And I get asked that sometimes too. And one of the things that I wasn't thinking about it from this perspective when I wrote it, but you become the kind of person who says, look, it's my bench press, I'm going to do 10. You do 1 more, you do 11. I even say, if you're riding the treadmill for 45 minutes, you can build that habit of, okay, I'm going to do 1 more minute, I do 46. What's the difference in that minute? Well, you stack up that minute over a year, there's a difference, but also your identity begins to changes. And I'm not telling you go from 45 minutes to 3 hours on a treadmill. So actually what I was doing is I wasn't thinking of it from this perspective, but now that I'm thinking about it, actually our work is sort of converging, almost in the exact same space. Now, establishing habits. I think very few things in books are actually life-changing. Because this is a life-changing thing. Tim Grover's a good friend of mine. He's like, not every show you do is life-changing. And I'm like, it is to me, man. Every one of them, I wouldn't put it out if it wasn't life-changing. And I go, well, which ones are? He goes, mine. What do you have me on? You've been on a couple times. But the truth is, I actually think this is life-changing work you did when you talk about habit loops. And so I've discussed in life, in fact, I learned it in baseball. I learned in baseball about triggers. We put your batting gloves on, triggering a state. I teach it with my athletes. I've talked about it on the show before. I know sometimes even walking into a room or a song can trigger something if there was a memory that happened in a space. But I never thought about it at all as it related to habits. And you call it, so I want you to use your terminology, but let's talk about how do we create habits and what is a habit loop? Because I feel like to some extent that's the foundation of for me in the book when I went, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. This is actually how you do this. No one's ever explained this before. So explain.
So I like to divide habits into 4 different stages, 4 steps. And I think if you understand those 4 steps, then you not only get what a habit is from a scientific standpoint, you understand how the process works, you also have 4 different places where you can intervene. So it's like a practical application. You have 4 different ways that you can adjust a habit and make it more likely to build a good one or break a bad one. So the 4 stages, just from a real high level, are cue, craving, response, and reward. Cue, craving, response, and reward. So the cue is, like you said, some kind of trigger that tells your brain to initiate the habit. It's like a prompt or something that gets you started. So like the ambulance driving down the road, when you hear the siren, that's an auditory cue that starts the habit of pulling to the side of the road. Or if you see a plate of cookies on the counter in the kitchen, that's a visual cue, starts the habit of eating a cookie. Now, the next stage is the craving, and the scientific way to describe this is it's a prediction that your brain makes about what that cue means. So you see the plate of cookies on the counter, without even really having to think about it, your brain sort of makes this automatic prediction, oh, those cookies will be sweet, sugary, tasty, enjoyable. And it's that favorable meaning that you assign to the cue that motivates you to take the third step, which is you walk over, you pick the cookie up and take a bite. And then finally, there's the fourth stage, the reward. Oh, it is in fact sweet, sugary, tasty, enjoyable, and so that's rewarding. Now, not every behavior in life is rewarding, right? Sometimes things have a cost or a consequence. Sometimes they're just kind of neutral and don't really mean a whole lot. But if a behavior is not rewarding, it's unlikely to become a habit, because your brain needs some kind of positive emotional signal, some reason to repeat that experience in the future. You need some way to mark it and say, hey, that felt good, that was worth it, you should do this again when you're in a similar situation next time. So cue, craving, response, reward, and that's kind of how we go around the loop and explain like what that habit loop is, and pretty much all behaviors go through those stages in some way. And the more that you go around them, the tighter the feedback loop becomes. It's like it reinforces the behavior, and eventually you're tying your shoes or grabbing a cookie or unplugging the toaster after each use, and you're just doing all those things kind of automatically, not even really thinking about it.
Can you give me a practical application of that? If we just walked through any habit, doesn't matter, I want to establish, can you give me a practical application of that, a strategic application of how I would do it?
Sure. So once we have those four stages, I like to try to operationalize it. How do we make this actionable? How do we apply it to a habit, like you're asking? And to do that, I've come up with what I call the 4 laws of behavior change. And so there's one law for each stage. And if you follow these, they give you kind of like a high-level framework for building a good habit or breaking a bad one. So real quick, again, from a high level, the 4 laws are, the first law is to make it obvious. You want the cues of your good habits to be obvious, available, visible, easy to see. Easier it is for it to get your attention, the more likely you are to act on it. Second law is to make it attractive. So again, this one connects to the craving, right? The more attractive or appealing or exciting or enticing a habit is, the more likely you are to perform it. The third law is to make it easy. The easier, more convenient, frictionless, simple a habit is, the more likely you are to do it. We've already talked a little bit about that. The 2-minute rule is an example of making it easy. And then the fourth law is to make it satisfying. The more satisfying or enjoyable, rewarding, or pleasurable a habit is, the more likely you are to repeat it. So those 4 laws, make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying, they give you a high-level framework for building a habit. If you're ever not sure what to do, if you say, how can I make this more habitual, or how can I do a better job of doing this consistently, you can just go through those 4 and ask yourself, how can I make it obvious? How can I make it more attractive? How can I make it easier? How can I make it more satisfying? And you'll start to find opportunities to do those things. And of course, the whole book is organized around sharing different strategies for doing that. But let me just give you a couple of personal examples so you can see how this might be applied. When the pandemic started, I knew that I was going to start, I wasn't going to have to be driving or traveling as much, so I wanted to spend that time. Some of that time I was spending traveling previously, but I wanted to use it productively and read more. So I opened up my phone and I downloaded Audible for audiobooks, and I moved the app to the first screen on my phone. I moved all the other apps to the second screen. So the only thing I saw when I opened my phone up was Audible. Now, that's a very small thing, does not radically transform your behavior, but it was a way of making reading more obvious, right? So that's the first law, making it obvious. Let me get it in front of me. I also sprinkled books kind of around the house, around my desk. Like I have 3 on my desk right now. I have a couple by the bed. I've got a couple in the living room. And the point for me was I never wanted to be far from a good idea. Like I always wanted to be kind of surrounded by something that was interesting or useful to read. And odds are it's more likely that I pick it up and take a look at it. On the flip side, this also applies, this first law of making it obvious, it also applies to many of the bad habits that we have. So, for example, a lot of people feel like they watch too much television, but walk into any living room. Where do all the couches and chairs face? It's like, what is this room designed to get you to do that? And so I think the question that you can ask yourself for this first law and making your habits obvious is, what does this space encourage? Right? What behavior is encouraged in this area? And you want to design your life, design the spaces that you live and work in to encourage the good habits and discourage the bad ones, to make the path of least resistance, or the obvious choice, the good habit. So the healthy food is on the counter, not the junk food. Books are around you, not the TV remote, and so on and so forth. And no individual choice like that is going to radically transform things, but you can see how making a dozen or 24 or 50 little tweaks like that, now all of a sudden you're living in a space that always is kind of like nudging you toward the more productive behavior.
Well, you're brilliant. This is so good. I often feel that change is, change is mental. Change oftentimes is much more environmental than it is mental. And anybody that's ever had a baby around their house, we know not to leave certain things on the floor. Put the gate up to go up the staircase. There's things you do in their environment to protect them. There just becomes a particular age where we think no longer our environment dictates any of our choices or our behaviors. The other thing your environment can do is it can dull your senses as to what is a healthy environment or what are healthy choices. So it might not be obvious cookies on something, but it can be environment, the people around you, their behavior choices, the noise level, auditories, which you talked about earlier. And sometimes it can just dull what we think is normal compared to an extraordinary environment. And so it's, if you walk into any really sick person's home, for the most part, their environment looks a little bit different than an unfit person's home. Your point earlier about making your bed. Most successful people that I know make their bed every day. Most of them do. And most of the people that I know that aren't successful don't make their bed every single day. These seem like ridiculous things environmentally, but there's a messiness, there's a clutter to not making the bed that starts a day. There's a structure, and I guess it's a clean, tight, organized thing about just habitually doing that daily. So all of these things are huge, and I just think the way that you describe it, by the way, you can tell it's a book you need to get if you've not gotten it. 5 million people plus already have. But James also has a newsletter that I want to make sure I promote, because there's just only so much good ideas out there in the world, and James is full of them. And so where do we go get it, James? How do we get your newsletter?
Yeah, it's called 321, and each week I share 3 short ideas from me, 2 quotes from other people, and then 1 question to think about. And you can just go to jamesclear.com and click on newsletter.
Get it, guys.
I thought you brought up a really good point with the structuring the environment for like a baby or a young child. It's very obvious for us to do that because we're trying to set them up for success, right? Like you don't want to put the baby in an environment where, they're surrounded by sharp objects or things that could fall on them or ledges they could trip over or whatever. And that seems so straightforward when you think about it with a child, but like, why would you not? I want to do that with yourself as well. You know, set the environment up for success. Stack the odds in your favor by putting yourself in an environment where the good outcome is the more likely one.
I think people don't do it, James, because they look at someone like yourself that's a high performer, or myself, they think we are, and I think they think we're just ultra disciplined. And discipline comes in a lot of different forms. And so discipline is, for me, I always tell people, show me your habits and show me your calendar. I can pretty much show you what your life's going to look like, right? Your calendar looks like crap. You're not loaded with enough stuff that you should be doing that serves whatever your goals and outcomes are. Habitually, you don't do the right things. You're going to end up long-term with a particular result. But I think that the notion